excited to bring to you this conversation today with two of our incredible medical advisory board members who are experts in the field of assistive and augmentative communication, which is such a hot topic for the HIE community. We have such a range of outcomes of kids, and we have a lot of kids that do have challenges with being verbal and using verbal communication. And so just really excited to bring you Dr. Carole Zangari and Tina Moreno. And so welcome to both of you to this chat. And so if you are joining in live on Facebook, please make sure that you let us know in the comments where you're joining from. You're welcome to ask questions along the way, and we'll try to address them either in the chat or after we get done with kind of our conversation in a Q&A. And just a reminder that this is a time that we are not unfortunately able to offer like one-to-one consultations about your own child, but you can ask questions that might be able to be answered in a more educational sense. So I'd love to start and have each of you introduce yourselves and speak a little bit about your background and kind of, evolutional journey with AAC. So whoever wants to start.
Tina, I'll toss it to you first.
Oh, I thought you might go first, Carole. I'm Tina. I am a speech language pathologist who's been working in the field of AAC for a while now. I work for a county board of developmental disabilities as an AAC consultant. And I do evaluations and training and coaching and all those things to families, as well as to schools. I also have a small private practice on the side, and I'm a member of ASHA, and I'm an assistive technology professional through RESNA. I'm co-founder and co-director of Camp Alec. Camp Alec is an AAC and literacy camp that happens in Grand Rapids, Michigan every summer, where we have about 20 kids from all over the country who come and spend the week with us on their own. They spend half their days engaged in super fun literacy activities under the direction of Drs. Karen Erickson and David Copenhaver. And then the rest of their days are all spent, oh my gosh, with adapted zip lining and swimming and just all those cool pranks and campfires and all those fun things that kids like to do at summer camp. And then at that camp, we also, it's a training camp where Drs. Karen Erickson and David Copenhaver bring in educators and therapists from all over the country and in Canada and New Zealand to kind of have this really hands-on intensive training in literacy instruction with kids with significant disabilities and complex communication needs. And then I am vice president of the U.S. Society of AAC, but really most importantly, I'm here in this place in this time right now because of my son, Mateo, who is 22, and he has been an AAC user since the age of 4. He had his first device. He's on number 5, I think we decided. Now he just got a new one. And I was a graphic designer before this. And when we started our journey, and he has apraxia and dysarthria, and his speech was really, really unintelligible, but he had so much to say. We found AAC through a parent, not through a professional. We had a friend who said, hey, you need to look at these machines. So we did, and this was before iPads and such. And so I've been learning alongside Mateo all about AAC and all those things. So that's me.
Amazing.
Well, I had to have Tina go first because she's so much more fun telling you all about camp and that good stuff. I'm Carole Zangari. I'm a speech language pathology professor in South Florida, where I teach only AAC classes. Lucky me. I'm at an age where, they let you do things that you've been wanting to do your whole life. So no, I've been teaching AAC classes to speech language pathologists since, let me think, maybe about 1989, right? Quite a while. But here at Nova Southeastern University for since 1994. and have been really doing AAC my entire career. In addition to teaching the next generation of speech language pathologists, I do a number of things in the community. One is to run a very large service grant for kids with autism and related disabilities. And I'm also involved, as Tina was saying, with some of the professional organizations and disability related organizations that have a lot to do with AAC. So I am one of the members of the organization that Tina's a VP for, USAC, the U.S. Society for AAC, and I sit on the Disaster Relief Committee. And the cool thing about that committee is if you ever know anybody who's involved in a major disaster, a fire, a flood, a hurricane, tornado, and they lose access to their AAC device through that, they can reach out to us and we'll figure out how to get them one at no cost to the family. So that's a fun project that I work on. I also work with the American Speech Language Hearing Association. At the moment, I am quite busy. As a matter of fact, we're getting ready for our national convention in November, and I'm the chair for the AAC Strand. So we have a really exciting conference with AAC users as featured speakers, invited speakers, coming to help educate the speech language pathologists that are in practice today and some that are coming up. And then I'm also have a role as the AAC co-strand advisor with some colleagues from around the country for the Assistive Technology Industry Association, which has a national conference once a year in Orlando for all things assistive technology. And it's been my pleasure to sit on the medical advisory board for Hope for HIE. I'm really looking forward to talking all things AAC with you guys this afternoon.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both of you for taking the time today, being a part of the advisory board, and just all the things that you do. And there are just so many questions that people have about AAC, and in particular, why don't we start a little bit talking about the evolution and really kind of defining what AAC is. So because there's lots of different communication methods out there that kind of fall under that bucket.
So I'll start with that. So AAC, if folks don't know, stand for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. And the augmentative part is the part that we all know best. And that is when kids might have some ability to speak, but just a little bit or not very intelligibly, and we're augmenting or we're adding to that. And then the alternative piece, very few people have experience with, but there are some situations where no speech is possible. It might be someone who, let's say, is intubated and not able to use a speaking valve. It may be somebody who has a significant motor challenge and doesn't have the motor capacity for speech. So there we're really looking, to be an alternative to what would happen through natural speech. It's a field that's kind of emerged from the bottom up, and that's, I think, one of the things I love about it. Didn't start with a bunch of people doing research studies or anything like that, but really from clinicians who were working with folks who had problems that couldn't be solved through traditional means of the day. In the 1950s and the 1960s, we started to see some technology in the 70s and beyond. But it really emerged from the bottom up. And, it's one of the most creative fields, I think, that I've had the pleasure to be associated with, because it has input from so many different directions. You have a personal situation that brings you to AAC, but as a whole field, we serve children from infancy and through people who are elder adults. I think my oldest patient was maybe 82 years old. He was the retired chief of staff in a local hospital, who ended up with ALS. So we serve the age span, the ability level in many respects, whether it's cognitive ability from very, very profound intellectual disabilities to those who are gifted, motor impairment from folks that can only maybe move their eyes, and not so great at that, all the way to those that are athletically talented. So it's a big tent. And that means that there are a lot of different ways that we serve them. And there's a lot of different tools and approaches that are used. And that's why I was really glad to hear Betsy say, you know, we're not going to be able to give individual advice because these kids are so different. These individuals are so different one from another.
Yeah. You know, and it's really interesting to see, you know, this, I want to say like 3 or 4 years ago for Hope for HIE, it was like, we need to start like talking about this more, advocating more for earlier, you know, for our families to ask about it. And then I was just saying right before this call, or, you know, right before we went live, that we've seen this incredible uptick in accessibility to these resources to get kids you know, involved with this type of communication much earlier. So I'd love to hear your perspective on where we are with that and kind of where things you think are going.
Well, it is amazing that AAC does seem a lot more accessible. When we're out and about, we see a lot more people out there with communication systems. Certainly when we started on this journey, when Mateo was so young and we didn't know anybody at all who had anything like that. And we talked a little bit before we went live that the iPad, certainly tablets, has really made a huge difference in terms of making voices affordable and making them a little bit easier to come by rather than necessarily going through really lengthy traditional medical insurance assessments. But there's so much more information out there, right? There are so many people talking about AAC. There are amazing communities online and therapists online who are sharing information and on Instagram and TikTok and all those crazy things. So it's just a lot easier, I think, for families to connect and to learn a little more, you know, to figure out what the questions are to ask, to figure out how to get assessed, to help embed communication at home, right? Because it's something that we don't learn how to communicate going to a therapy session 30 minutes weekly. You know, that's something that happens 24 hours a day when we're interacting with people we care about. And so I hope that families are feeling more and more supported by one another as we're having these conversations on all kinds of different platforms.
Definitely. Yeah, so I think some of the questions that have come in, you know, as we're prepping for this, and I think we can start kind of at the beginning of, you know, even especially for our community, most of our families know from birth in the early neonatal period that their child might be at risk for developing some sort of disability. So a lot of people are wondering, you know, what age can a child start using, you know, AAC? When is an appropriate time to ask? When is there, you know, because before, I think a lot of our families were told like, oh, you got to wait till age 3 or, you know, things like that. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on, you know, what advice you'd give or what you see the landscape is for families of really young kids that might be at risk for not being able to verbally communicate strongly and you know, when that would be appropriate.
Say, you know, as soon as you have a good inclination that the child you're talking about is really likely to have a significant gap between what they can share with the world and what they'll understand about the world, that's really the time to start, right? And so for some families, that might be at 2 months, right? For other families, it might be at 3 years, you know, and, you know, could even be older than that. But this is sort of a, you know, a situation where the sooner we begin to introduce this different way of communicating that gets added on to the ways you're already communicating, the better the outcome is likely to be. And generally, the issues with starting early are not so much that the kids, can't benefit from it. It's that we as caregivers, right, can only do so much, right?
Mhm.
And at that time, we may be focusing on higher priority areas, silly things like breathing or swallowing or, staying seizure free, those kinds of things that have real high priority, high impact, implications for us. Of course, they're going to be on our minds until we feel a little bit like stable, like the ground is a little bit solid under us with things like that. So I wouldn't be worried about starting too soon. I would say, in general, when we err on the deciding, when to intervene, we get to folks too late, right? So there's almost no one I see at 3 years old for the first time that I didn't wish I had seen at 12 months, right? Or 18 months, obviously nobody has a crystal ball. But I would say err on the side of cautiousness and get in there sooner rather than later. I don't know, Tina, anything to add or disagree about?
No, the only thing I wanted to add is that I think, we're talking about augmentative and alternative communication, and we're talking about it being something that individuals use to express themselves, right? To use expressively, but I think that we also can keep in mind that it's a teaching tool. It's as much about using it to teach children language and teaching interaction as it is expecting them to utilize it someday to augment how they're communicating. So that's another reason why the earlier the better, right? Because we can utilize that tool to help pair symbols with meaningful language and natural contexts to teach that communication. So, yeah.
Right. And, I feel like I've seen so many graphics out there when people talk about just typical speech development of, how many words and how often and things like that. And if you think about how kids that might need that technology to help them communicate, how all of that time they'd miss out on without trying to introduce this. It's really, I think that call for early intervention just continues to be such an advocacy point for so many things. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So there's another question that came up, and I know, Tina, you had mentioned a little bit with your own experience with Mateo about, having a child that his speech was hard to understand. So, the question is, can it be used with a child that's difficult to understand? And obviously that's yes. So, so I guess maybe talking through maybe a little bit more of your, personal experience, and then, both of you with where, again, where those guardrails might come into play, to help guide, families to ask the questions of their teams.
Yeah. So our personal experience was that we anticipated Mateo would have challenges speaking intelligibly for quite some time. We could understand him at a 1-word, 2-word, 3-word level sometimes, but certainly other people had greater issues comprehending his speech. And so we wanted to make sure that everyone could understand him because he had so very, very much to talk about. And for him, it's been, this balancing act, because he really, I would say he probably views himself, well, and maybe not so much anymore, but over the years, he's definitely viewed himself as a verbal communicator. And he will go verbal first every single time. And it was really a learning process for him to realize that verbal speech was very, very difficult for him to learn. So at 22, I think he's finally figured that out. But I have to say that journey for kids who do have some speech, you've got good days, you've got bad days. It's just this evolution of figuring out best ways to communicate to whom, when, and where. And so it's good, and it, you know, it can be rocky too. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, I think so. I think that's just such a, you know, there's so much of that too, of that gray area in so many different parts of development and so many different parts of, you know, what interventions might be helpful. You know, we see that on the cerebral palsy side as well, of, you know, even mobility. You know, sometimes there's kids that are in this like in between that have some mobility, but their, you know, sustainability for, you know, walking long distances is just not there. And so having an assistive device is helpful for them to maintain their energy, be able to participate, things like that. And it's a tool for them to use to have a, you know, better quality of life and, you know, do the things that they need to do and have that access to do what they want to do. There seems to be a little bit of a parallel there too.
You know, I think another point that sometimes people don't realize right away about AAC is that it isn't always a primary means of communication for some people. It can be a secondary, tertiary means of communication. So, you know, communicating is all about what your partner is, who they are, what they know about you, what the context is, right? And so I've worked with plenty of folks with cerebral palsy where, you know, because I've always worked with folks with cerebral palsy, I understand the CP accent a little bit more, maybe, you know, than the person behind me at the grocery store. And so maybe for me, they'll communicate orally. Mm-hmm. Right. Whereas, you know, with somebody else, they may try that, right, and, you know, kind of get the deer in the headlights look back and then use their AAC as a backup system, as a way to clarify what they said, as a way to sort of repair communication breakdown. And that's perfectly valid. You can use AAC with the intent of it not being your first access to language when you're interacting with people. But, oh, it's here, you know, if I need it, if it's a crowded, noisy environment, for example, you know, and I can't project very well, right? Or if I know it's going to be at the end of the day and my motor system collapses a little bit and I'm more dysarthric, you know, when I'm tired than when I'm, you know, alert. You know, there's all kinds of valid ways of using AAC outside of, and in addition to it being your primary way of talking to people.
Such an important point to make. And I just want to address one quick question that came in the chat, which is asking about how common it is for kids with HIE to have, you know, either not be able to speak verbally or have, you know, impacted verbal abilities. And, you know, I don't think that there's actually a statistic necessarily out there that captures this appropriately. You might be, you know, we can talk generalities about cerebral palsy and things like that, that can be outcomes of HIE. But certainly there is you know, a good percentage of kids in our community. We know that upwards of 40% will develop some form of CP, and CP can affect, as we just talked about, in multiple different ways. You have people with CP that are, you know, marathon runners and have their speech impacted, and you have people with CP that are, you know, in a wheelchair and have no problems verbally speaking, and anything and everything in between. And so, you know, I just want to share that for those that are maybe a little bit newer on their journey and, you know, tuning in today or in the replay, you know, just to address that real quick. So.
Oh, do you have something, Carole? She's looking for something.
No, I was just trying to think of, I was just trying to kind of think of, you know, whether I'd seen anything like that. And I really haven't, you know, as you were saying, Betsy, you know, from the professional ends of things, the way things are tracked, it's more according to presenting diagnosis, like a cerebral palsy, like a dysarthria, that sort of thing, rather than the HIE as overall.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we call HIE, you know, I think we coined it this month actually of all months. It's a catalyst diagnosis. So it can lead to many different things and in different ways. Yeah, very, so thank you for asking that question to our member in the chat. So another question that has come up is it possible for you to teach your child on your own? Because there are obviously apps out there now. There's you know, different methodology. You know, what is your, I guess, advice to families who are kind of looking at, you know, resources are always, you know, vary depending on where you live and what you have access to, and I guess how would you go out answering that?
Can I start, Carole? Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely.
Please fill in. So I think that the first thing I want to say is that let's not think about AAC as teaching somebody a skill, because I think then it seems really intimidating. And I think that maybe we can think of our role as parents is to just communicate and to model within natural ways. So if we use teaching, then we think maybe we have to come up with really structured activities and lessons, and it gets really intimidating. And at the end of the day, when we've eaten and toileted and like, it's just a lot. So I think that absolutely parents can and should and do the bulk of this communication learning with our kids, because that's who we are. We're the family unit, and we've got all our routines. But in terms of identifying the right system, in terms of identifying a communication system that meets the unique needs of that individual child, I do feel like an assessment by a speech language pathologist with some experience in AAC is the best way to go. And I know that can be really difficult. It's so challenging to find somebody in some areas. So that is very, very difficult. But I empower parents to do it, and just like you would help your other children acquire language and communicate and protest and ask questions and all that, you're going to do it the same way with AAC. AAC is just a different way of communicating. We're still learning vocabulary, and we're still learning to communicate for lots of different reasons. It's just a different voice, that's all.
There are so many nuances to this, and I absolutely agree. Is it possible to teach, to help your kid learn to use AAC, on your own as a family member? 100%, absolutely. But, if we dig a little bit deeper, I think it works really best when your child is sort of at that later beginning stage of communication. So they may not understand AAC at all, or they may be just using one picture at a time, or starting to make short sentences. But I think when you go to the either end of the hump in the bell curve there, right, you probably are really going to want to work with professionals. So for example, once kids are using AAC effectively beyond the basics, right, we want to get them ready for careers in college, right? And so that may mean that we're teaching higher level language skills, because as Tina was saying, there's a lot of language learning that works well through just observational learning, right? Through incidental learning, right? But for some kids, that doesn't take us all the way to the finish line, right? They only get so much from them. Many of them need explicit instruction, whether it's to speak, with a wider variety of words and expand their vocabulary, whether it's to say more complex sentences, to be able to use more sophisticated languages like inferences and metaphors, right? Like we always rejoice when somebody's putting a 5-word sentence together, right? But what keeps me up at night is the kids that are not graduating with standard diplomas and going off to a work of their choosing, or to college or whatever else they choose. And I believe that for a subset of these kids, it's not because of their inherent disability. It's because we stopped raising the bar. We got so excited of what they could do, we forgot there's still a gulf between them and what they have to do in order to achieve the goals they've set for themselves along with their family. So I think, in some respects, at certain points, professional help is really going to accelerate the process. And, developmental periods come for, in very complex ways. And so while you could potentially do this, right, if your kid wants to go to college when his friends are going to college, right, we want to do it as quickly as possible. And working with a professional, can help with that. But I also want to address sort of that other side right, of the hump in the bell curve there, right? And we have kids who have very, very significant multiple disabilities as a result of their injury. And these may be kids that have, fluctuating arousal levels. These may be kids that don't seem to connect easily, and you can't always tell what they can truly see, what they can really hear, what they're taking in from the world around them. Those kids also really, I think, they're going to be learners. They certainly are, right? And we're going to work with them. But I think those are areas where professional guidance is really needed to help you understand what are the intervention strategies we know that will be helpful to those kids that are really at the very, very beginning stages of their communication journeys.
Oh, that's such important information, especially for our families. I know this comes up all the time. And, you brought up, I think one of the biggest advocacy messages out there for people with disabilities, which is presuming competence and not setting those limits on people and seeing where they can go and grow. And I think a lot of times it's even hard for families to understand and not place those because they have not had experience or they haven't, seen what's possible. And I just, I'm so glad that you brought that up because it's such an important advocacy point as well.
I use the term presuming potential, right? Not that we are looking at them now and saying, yeah, they're competent in whatever we're looking at. But presuming potential, or the way a lot of people interpret presuming competence, is the same idea that given the right supports and services, if I dose it correctly, if I give you enough of that intervention and it's the right intervention strategy, right, you're going to move forward with this. Right? You're going to move forward with this. And I've been doing this a long time, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between, and I have yet to really meet kids that couldn't move forward. In one way or another, we meet them where they are. They are very different intervention strategies, but these kids are all learners. They were born to be learners.
So important. That is just such great information. I know that people are gleaning from this, and I am as well. And so, I think one of the questions that I'd love to explore a little more too, when we talk about this, is just, there are two different sides of support too that I think a lot of people have access to that might vary. There's the medical-based therapy clinic side of this, and there's kind of a school-based side as well. So, which can be a support. And again, that the resources vary widely with that. So, how do you see those fitting together, or families trying to have everyone on the same page, as there can be definitely different opinions out there about, a child or, what resources or things like that to pull together?
I guess it's easiest if we can get everybody on the same page, isn't it? But that doesn't always happen like we like. I think communication is going to be critical. I think trying to get that communication between family, home, and hospital is very, very important. I think schools have maybe a different role in that their interventions, there needs to be an educational component to it. And so sometimes the direction of those interventions are a little bit different in school versus hospital. And I think that they all need to work together to be sure that something is happening that's comprehensive as possible.
I totally agree. In an ideal world, that's what we're looking for. If there is private and school SLP, sometimes they're not collaborating actively. As long as they're pointed in the right direction and as long as they're not at cross purposes. I've worked in situations where, in one setting they worked on swallowing, right? And in the other setting they worked on AAC, or in one setting they worked on the AAC interaction skills, and in another setting they worked on the language development. So they don't all have to be doing the same thing, but not working at cross purposes. And I can go out on a limb because I've never worked for a school district and I probably never will. But I can say that I've worked with very few AAC users who can get what they need in AAC learning through the school system alone.
Okay.
You know, first of all, IDEA was a great idea, right? But it was never funded to the states the way that it was promised, you know, not even anywhere close. And so we had I guess a champagne taste and we got a beer budget. So the implementation of it is really insufficient to meet the needs of the vast majority of kids that use AAC. It's not the fault of any district, of any school, of any person. It's systemic. It's a systemic problem. So I would say that if at all possible, to look for, you know, some supplemental, you know, support outside of the school. If that's not possible, what I would really focus on is getting you really trained up as much as possible. And so there are mechanisms in the IEP for you to put that into that legal document to get AAC training, not necessarily on the device. You can figure that out from the representative that sold it to you, or, you know, or YouTube, right? But like, what do you do with it? Now that I know how to like set it up or change the voice or, you know, add a picture, like now, how do I use it to help my kiddo develop to his language potential, right? That's what you need training on.
That is, thank you for addressing that. And, you know, this I think is a kind of dovetails nicely into, you know, obviously the outpatient clinical setting is so critically important for this, but there are other opportunities as well. And I know I've heard of community groups of AAC users that get together. There's camps. So I'd love to have you guys talk a little bit more about some of the community support programs that you're aware of or have started or know of out there as well.
Well, Tina, you are the queen of this. So you start off, tell everybody more about Camp Alec.
So before we even start on Camp Alec, I have to say that we kind of entered into this AAC community through a different camp, and that was called Camp Chatterbox. So when Mateo was 7, we discovered Camp Chatterbox in New Jersey, and we drove from Cleveland to New Jersey every summer for several years. And that's where we really found our families, right? This was really before all this, I don't know, Facebook and all the ways you can connect now via social media and online. We were alone. And meeting our families there and spending a week in cabins, grungy and smelly, and just having so much fun, that's our forever family. And so we wanted to develop a camp that focused on literacy as well as AAC for those kids who couldn't attend a camp on their own. So that's kind of how Camp Alec came to be born. My dearest friend, we met her family through Camp Chatterbox. Her son Alec passed away suddenly at the age of 15, and that's what we named Camp Alec after him. His body was very complex, and he couldn't attend a camp on his own without a familiar care provider coming, whereas Mateo did. There was a camp in Minnesota that he attended a couple years on his own because he can kind of take care of himself with some support most of the time. But we wanted an opportunity like that for kids who had more complex bodies and more significant needs. So that idea of community that you talked about, Betsy, is so paramount for us. It's what made us all who we are, right? It's given Mateo at the age of 7, seeing older kids who were going to go off to college, who had these amazing communication systems and could say anything they wanted. It was making him feel like he was part of a community and not so different because all these other kids used similar voices. And for us, it meant that we had mentors. It meant that we could learn how to implement AAC at home all day long. It empowered us to learn more about the IEP process and about good interventions and just really dig deep. And I think Camp Alec does that quite a bit too. So our campers, unfortunately, COVID, of course, threw us for a loop, but in some ways there were some positives because our campers have stayed in contact throughout the year as opposed to just when we see each other at camp. And then there are some really, really nice groups for individuals who use AAC. ISAC, the International Society of AAC, they have an adult chat group that happens. I'm not finding the group. I'll have to send it to you, Betsy, so you could share it out. But there's AAC Connections. There's another one for younger people as well, where they get online and communicate that way. I know.
That's amazing.
Yeah, keeping in touch is really important.
Yeah, I love that I mean, this week's theme for Awareness Month is community, so it's really appropriate that we're talking about that. And, you know, I think we're trying to get more information out to our families in particular about different camp opportunities that are out there and different community, you know, opportunities to connect through different things specifically like this, because that is where a lot of that, you know, that empowerment comes for the entire family. You know, I can speak to the epilepsy side. Max got an epilepsy diagnosis in December 2020, and we got hooked in with the local epilepsy chapter, and he's going to a sleepaway camp this year for the first time, you know, and it's like, you know, especially since epilepsy came into our lives, we weren't sure if that would happen, but I know I've seen CP camps. I've seen, I've heard of Camp Alec from you, Tina, and, you know, just seeing all these other opportunities where kids can be kids, but they also get to be, you know, with the people that understand them the most. And there is absolutely nothing more priceless than, I think, that gift of community.
I'll just add to the conversation about camps. Since it's that time of year where people are thinking about it pretty darn seriously. So one thing I do in my copious free time, between 3 and 5 a.m., is I run a website called Practical AAC. And that has some posts about it on camp if you're interested in searching for there. But if you go to the Pinterest page, I have a Pinterest board with camps that I update once a year, usually about this time of year. I'm a little behind. But anyway, if anybody, because they're all over the country, right? And they, you know, these are folks like, you know, these are clinicians, these are parents, these are teachers, these are Rotary organizations, these are low budget organizations in many cases. So they don't have much of an advertising budget, and they don't have much capacity to take big groups. So you may not know about them, and they may be in your state, but some of the online communities that Tina was mentioning too, that Betsy was mentioning, it's a great place to start those conversations, because, you know, they pop up all the time, and you never know who knows about one that might be useful to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll definitely be sharing out those links after this call and in the comments after this chat is over, because it is definitely something that, unless you know, it's like, you only know if you know. So, and if someone told you, and like you said, a lot of times the information can be difficult to find. So, you know, definitely we'll be linking in as much as we can after this as well for our families to learn more and to try to connect and see what's available where they are or nearby in the region or something like that. Great. Let's see here. I don't think I've seen any other questions come in the chat. And I think I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Is there anything, I guess, what is your hope for this next curve of development with AAC and kind of the state of everything? You know, like we talked a little bit about, it seems to be in a very significant uptick. But what, you know, since you both have been involved in this, what are your greatest hopes for the future for this particular type of, you know, I guess, assistance and opening the doors for people to communicate?
Well, one thing that I think we're going to see a sea change in is technology. You know, just like the iPad, like, kind of blew us out of the water with, all the features that could get packed into that little thing and all it could do, and opened up a world for many people. I think we're on the verge of some other kinds of technological changes that will have a big impact in the field. We're talking about things like wearables or even implantables, right? There's a lot going on in brain-computer interfacing, for example. There's going to be a lot of artificial intelligence applications in AAC. Wouldn't it be great to have an AAC device that sort of knows where you are? So when you go into Target, right, it's like, oh, you're at Target. Let me pop up the vocabulary that you use the most often when you're in Target. I think there's a lot that's going to be happening technologically that is going to make the AAC learning curve a lot, easier on all of us, and, make the use of AAC easier for people who need to communicate with it every day. So I don't know if that's my top wish, but it is coming down the pike, and I wanted to, give people, kind of a heads up. I think, this will be a field to watch over the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
I totally agree. I think that the technology that we'll be seeing in the next 5 to 10 years will be entirely different and unrecognizable for us now. I mean, it has such great potential. I think that another hope that's not related to the technology for me is definitely that we continue to see this growth of presuming potential. I want to see more and more momentum about literacy instruction for people who rely on AAC. I think that it's happening. We're talking about it, but I'd like to see that really permeate schools and all providers. I think that we just really have to continue to know that everybody can learn to read and write, and that the ability to spell is so particularly important for people who do rely on AAC, because it's only with spelling that you could say absolutely anything that you want to say, right? Otherwise, you can only communicate with the words that somebody else programmed on your device that are already there. So I hope that this momentum continues, and we continue talking about literacy and learning and just all that potential for individuals who use AAC. Yeah.
I'll add one other thing, we're talking about like what's on the horizon. In the field of speech language pathology, it can be really hard to find an SLP who also knows AAC. Right. And so, whether they're based in the schools, whether they're based in the, private practice, a hospital clinic, right. When we think about the folks who are practicing as speech language pathologists today, more than likely, they went to school at a time before this was in the curriculum, let alone had an opportunity to have mentored clinical guidance into learning how to support them. So they're kind of learning on the job. They're kind of learning, through going to conferences and workshops and reading journal articles and things like that. So we've always had kind of a shortage of folks who know AAC and our speech language pathologists, and we are making good inroads there in terms of the programs that prepare speech language pathologists and their ability to help graduate students who are competent in this area. I'm super proud of my own university for being, among the first to require it back in the 90s. Whereas, some programs still today don't even have a course in AAC. So you could graduate in speech pathology and you got some AAC, knowledge in your autism class or your motor speech class, but never really a devoted course in AAC. But the other thing to be aware of, it's on the horizon for the next couple of years, is that there will be specialty certification in AAC for speech language pathologists. That's in the process of being developed now. There's specializations for speech and language pathologists in other areas, and swallowing and fluency in other areas. And that's in the works for AAC as well. So, you know, it's a bit of a controversial issue among speech language pathologists, because like anything, there's a light and a shadow side. But the upside for families is that you may well have an easier time of figuring out who truly is, you know, has the skills to back it up, an expert in AAC, so that you can, you know, if you're lucky enough to live near one of them, factor that into your decision making.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I guess one of the questions, we talked about camps a little bit, and I just wanted to make sure we cover this too. You know, I know that there are, you know, physical therapy intensives and things like that. Is there an intensive model of therapy that involves, you know, AAC?
I think there are some places that do that, you know, so for example, the Napa clinics, you know, have AAC specialists. I will say, you know, some of the camps, that's their focus as well.
Right.
You know, so they may be a week-long camp, and, you know, separating out parents to get trained in one side of the camp and kids to be working with, you know, clinicians and special educators and graduate students to do, you know, fun things in the afternoon and real language and AAC learning for part of the day as well. So there is that model kind of spotted around the country.
Sure. Great. Well, this has been so incredible and so helpful. I know that, you know, we are so thankful for both of you for your involvement, obviously with Hope for HIE, but just in the work that you do and just moving forward this field. It is absolutely incredible. And we, you know, again, thank you for your time today. And just thank you to everyone who's been commenting and joining in. And if you're catching this on the replay, make sure that if you have questions that come up, we are happy to take them back to Carole and Tina after this, and, you know, continue that conversation. And again, we'll be sharing more resources. There are a ton out there, and, you know, both of you have made such incredible resources as well, so I'll be sure to link to those afterwards. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you
So much.